Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Software Plaza podcast. I'm Dwayne Taylor, editor at Software Plaza, and I have just the privilege of speaking to different people each week on what they're building in the space of cloud native computing. And it's really exciting. It's something that I really look forward to because there's just so much that's happening in the space, and everyone is working on something unique, something different and taking their own approach to a problem that affects so many other uh, organizations are looking for these solutions. So, it's really been quite a whirlwind of past few years that we've had this podcast running. And over the years, I've had some interesting guests, but I've had a handful uh, of women in tech that have come on the show, and one of them is Sarah Polan, who's with me today. And from our last episode, the one thing that I remember most of what she said is that she's into boxing, and it's not too often that you get to hear that. Um, so yeah, so quite an interesting character and personality that we have here. Yeah, she's this year she's been into rock climbing and other stuff as well. Sustained some injuries, but she's still going at it. So quite a feisty woman here. Uh,
Thank you.
so Sarah is a transformational CTO. She's a consultant in digital infrastructure and scalability. And she describes herself as saying that her sweet spot is organizations in Series C, pre-IPO stage, organizations that have already got some runway and are now looking to really scale. And that's where she really comes in to help them with scaling. So I find it quite interesting that she's really identified where her sweet spot is, and it just and I think that would make for a really clear conversation today. And It's going to be quite a different conversation. Usually, most of our conversations are from a vendor side talking about their product and their solution, but this is going to be different. Today, we don't have a script. We've just got a bunch of ideas that we've hashed out just before this conversation, and we're going to riff on it. So we're going to be talking to Sarah about just things that she's observed as she's worked with different organizations, and particularly we're going to be focusing on yeah, an end user story that she's going to kind of describe in brief, without of course describing which is that end user organization for obvious reasons. But we're going to be kind of sketching it with broad strokes, just some of the challenges they faced, some of their objectives, their journey, and just where they're at today. That's kind of the plan for this chat. So it's going to be quite interesting if you like hearing end user stories, which I've heard many people really look forward to, especially in tech conferences. And it's going to be interesting also if you're in the financial sector, because the story we're going to talk about is from a company that's in this space. It would also apply to you if AI has been on your mind, because AI features strongly in this story as well. It's about an AI transformation or an AI adoption story, and just how that is. So all of that is what we're going to cover today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. With that, let's get into it. Sarah, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for coming back.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
All
And
right.
thank you for the kind opening. I think many will agree on the feisty side of things, for better or for worse.
No, I follow your posts on LinkedIn quite often, and it's nice that you're so active on LinkedIn, I think, and a lot of times people don't tell you because, LinkedIn is not the most engaging platform.
Yeah.
But I think when you do post something, it actually goes further than you think. And, I'm someone who definitely reads up on those posts and follows them, and they're really interesting, just your insights about tech and even just outside tech, the things you say, uh, you know, one of the interesting people that I follow on LinkedIn, I'd like to say.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind of you.
Yeah, so Yeah, so but I kind of briefly described like our conversation for today, which is we're going to be talking about this organization that is like a lot of other organizations, if you think of it, where they are in the process of transformation and especially in an age of AI. But
Mhm.
I'd probably allow you to kind of give us a better introduction into their situation, where they started at, and what were really their motivations for even thinking of a transformation. If you could kind of get us started with an overview there, that'll be great.
Yeah, I think a lot of times when you're looking at any type of organization, really, there needs to be a catalyst, especially if you really want to undergo this massive change. Because once you start looking at modernization, transformation, this idea of scaling everything in an automated fashion, there is a fair amount of risk involved with that. It's quite difficult to move older applications onto some of these newer technologies. Sometimes you think it's just going to be an easy lift and shift. At the end of the day, that's not the case. So having a really clear focus is, I think, hyper important in situations like this. And also understanding, what is the outcome that you need and when is it thereby. I'm a huge fan of Cotter's Eight Steps of Change. I don't know if you've heard those.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
kind of like a business school 101, but it's basically eight
Okay.
steps of how do you go through some sort of transformation within an organization, whether that's digital, whether that's cultural. But the first thing is, you form that initial group of people who are going to be guiding this, your like key stakeholders, and then
Ah,
really target down on what is the sense of urgency, what is driving that. And
okay.
sometimes that may be end of life
Mhm.
application or technology. Sometimes that may be a regulatory push. And I think frequently what we see more and more here, once, especially in the financial services sector, when you start looking at things like DORA, which was announced a few years ago and is now in
Mhm.
play, um, or some other kind of rules within the banking sector that are starting to come out, um, they become really the catalyst for this change. And they're
Mhm.
also becoming very clear about it has to be hit by X date, or there is the potential of a fine behind it. And the fines before, and in some of the legislation that you see, they're heavily hinted at. They're like, oh, we can fine you. It's not very clear about what might be the kind of max of
Mhm.
those fines. The newer regulations are very clear about what that is, and
Okay.
they're also clear about the arc of that. So DORA, for example, or several of the European Union laws are starting to state that there's a fine over your entire operating revenue
Wow.
globally. So it's not just in a particular country, it's really like if you are a global country, that is the fine that will be taken into account. Um,
Mhm.
so there's definitely a push there, and
Mhm.
some cost avoidance behind that.
Mhm.
But if it's going to put that urgency in place and really drive that forward, it's quite effective.
Yeah, yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is definitely a risk no organization wants to take. Uh, yeah. So compliance and regulation seems like the main driver for this change.
It's
Uh,
definitely, yeah, it's definitely one of the drivers. I think
mhm.
constantly changing infrastructure or underlying infrastructure is another one. Um,
Okay.
and I mean, we saw a couple years ago that the Broadcom acquisition of VMware was
Mhm.
also quite an instigator for a lot of organizations to undergo some sort of digital transformation to look at, you know, how do we, are we required to use all of this estate, the VMware, et cetera, or is it something else that we can look at shifting a little bit to?
Mhm. Mhm. Wow. Okay. Okay. Yeah, change of infrastructure, and that's something that probably it's never done. because by the time you're done with one change, there's the next one that's on the horizon.
Oh, for sure. And it's really hard too. If you look at how people build infrastructure and applications on top of that on VMs versus how they do that in containers. VMs
Mhm,
are always highly stateful, so you need to take into account what's kind of linked with all of these different VMs. On the flip
mhm,
side, containers are really meant for ephemeral infrastructure. So it's not easy just to take something that's running on a VM and port it over
mhm.
into containers, even
Oh,
if
yeah.
that seems like the lighter weight and easier option. There is a
Hmm.
lot of technical debt that you have to kind of understand. Am I going to redo it? Am I going to replatform? Kind of the
Hmm.
7 R's around that as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so you mentioned about just the risk of penalties
Mhm.
because of regulation. Other cost-related concerns, like thinking about things like how do we reduce costs without affecting performance, anything of that sort related to cost that is also a driver.
I mean, cost is a really interesting thing. I had a colleague that I used to work with at Hashi, who always used to remind me that cost is just another metric. But I think what's really important is how do you look at some of those metrics and how do you look at cost? The challenge we have within technology organizations is I think there's always a question that comes from the business about how's this going to impact my top line. And it's really difficult, especially when you're running shared services or things like security that aren't necessarily quantifiable in a manner that you could directly attribute them to a top line. You can say, look, we're running these things and we can look at the correlation with the overall bottom line. But I think to a certain extent, we probably need to start looking at it more holistically and saying, yeah, this is definitely a cost center,
Mm,
but are we making sure that we're closing that kind of revenue gap and we're making sure that what we're using makes sense to drive that forward?
mhm,
And I think it's the same drum that we've been beating for years, the automation, the
mm,
lightweight infrastructure, making sure that when you design things, you can do that in a modular way so that when one technology becomes end of life, you can swap those out.
mm,
Highly coupled infrastructure or applications or technology in general, they're
mhm.
very, very difficult to deal with and they're very
Yeah,
hard to modernize. Um,
yeah.
so while it looks like, yeah, potentially the cost is a little bit higher, the
Mm,
reality is what that saves you in terms of resiliency, in terms of other business benefits, is much
mm.
higher than I think we anticipate it to be.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned modularity. But in my other conversations as well in the past few weeks, something I've heard about with AI workloads specifically is that we're kind of taking a step back when it comes to AI, where we're not really putting modularity first and we're doing more,
Mm.
we're building monoliths. And so maybe just the thing that AI is so new that we're not really concerned about infrastructure and architecture as much right now. We're more focused on just value and proof points that this is what it can do. And I'm sure you have a lot to say. We'll get into a bit of that when talking about your views on just AI workloads and the
Mm.
adoption. But anything that comes to your mind as you hear this about just modularity versus monoliths, especially related to like the AI adoption.
Yeah, AI feels so new that, we don't really have best practices in place for it. And it's hard to understand how it's all coming together. And we were talking a little bit before about, what is this whole ecosystem and, what is the consolidation of that ecosystem going to look like?
Mm,
Because I think
mhm,
undoubtedly it has to happen. There are lots of tools that kind of do the same thing.
mhm,
There's a few foundational AI sort of models and organizations that deal with the foundational AI. So I think it'll
mhm,
be really interesting to see how it starts coming together more holistically. Where does it consolidate? How does this quote
mhm,
unquote bubble sustain, not sustain, and how do things flow from there?
Yeah.
But in building my own applications and looking at how do I integrate AI into that, I think for me, it's becoming a lot more apparent that you really need to understand context when it comes to integrating any type of AI into your system.
Mhm.
The sort of attack vectors that AI in general opens up, but specifically LLMs for things like prompt injection, and especially if you're moving towards something that's a little bit more agentic, it's very high. So if I expose that directly across my app without any context, without any type of role-based access, you know, I'm not terribly comfortable with that in my own coding,
Mhm.
especially if you are dealing with sensitive data, if you are dealing with financial transactions or even just financial information, even if you're not using that agentic process, there are just so many things that I can do to leverage AI in a way that wouldn't necessarily benefit the organization. So
Mhm.
again, on the regulatory perspective, the security side of things, that specific attack vector, but even just from a cost element,
Mhm.
in building things out, I've really started to understand that it's necessary to have that static model like you would in a traditional application that fronts off against the user and then for the user input, because that allows me to sanitize and restrict what's actually going into that LLM. And especially if you're looking at an LLM from the perspective of I'm paying on a token base per token basis, that can add up really quickly. And if you expose that directly to the outside, not only can somebody use that maliciously, but it can also just cost you a lot of money at the end of the day. So making
Mhm.
sure that we have some best practices put in place to, how do we interface with all of these things and how do we make sure that that context is very bound when it comes to using um, using AI in general and agents and things like that. I, I think it's going to become quite necessary. So it's important then to take a step back as an organization or as a builder to say, okay, how
Mhm.
am I going to make sure that I'm doing this in the best way possible that allows users to get the full experience and really kind of feel like they're having this one-to-one interaction with that human-like behavior, because that's why you use AI to begin with and not machine learning. But
Mhm.
then also, how am I making sure that the user is protected and the organization is protected as well?
Right, right. Wow. Yeah, that's a lot you packed in that response. And I wanted to just bring it down to even just this the story that we're talking about. So the organization, tell us a bit about them and just the background there. What were some of the constraints they were working with? As they were looking. So we saw that yeah, their objectives were around compliance, regulation, and changing infrastructure, just coping with that, and even just tying costs to the top line or the bottom line that you mentioned. Some of these were the agendas. Talk to us about just the constraints that they had. Talk to us about some of the options that were available to them, and just how they approached this. What was the start like?
Mm. I mean, again, this is something that happens in so many organizations that I've worked with is the move and the cultural shift that has to happen in order to start bringing in some of these newer technologies into house. Um, and also from a leadership perspective, and if I look at just my own leadership and how I've had to shift my leadership over time, um, going from, I can be the expert on the vast number of things that are coming into my particular domain or my product. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that anymore because it's so complex. There's so many things coming in. I need to now say, you know, my job is to ask questions. So I need to no longer be the master of everything, but just
Yeah.
the master of how do I ask questions to make sure that I'm doing the best thing possible for the organization that I'm working for. And that
Mm-hmm.
could be a financial institution, that could be a retail institution, that could be, my own fintech, but really understanding how to ask the right questions. And I think that's how you really, particularly as a leader, start shifting that dynamic and making sure that that culture goes with you. Because then, your people become the trusted people. Also, making sure that the accountability is in place so that when you ask the question and somebody doesn't know the answer, that's okay. Because there's no way everybody's going to know all of the answers. But then guiding them to say, okay, I think you need to look here in
Mm-hmm.
order to maybe look at some of those answers. Let's reconvene and then move forward. And not taking for granted your group of stakeholders because it's really easy to say, this is my immediate group of stakeholders. I think these are, the people that need to be involved and they're the ones who execute on a day-to-day basis. But taking a step back and saying, okay, they're the ones who execute on a day-to-day basis, but there are a lot of people around me who need to be able to have an input in this. If I'm working on the vendor side, for example, it's a question of, is there this, the sales component in there? Am I building a product that is something that a seller could stand behind, or is something that is seen as a need on the market? If I'm working with like a financial institution, for example, am I bringing in the correct business stakeholders to make sure that I'm building out, maybe if I'm looking at like a platform or a platform as a product, am I building that out in a way that's consumable for the broader ecosystem and the business side of things, and not just standing in my own little bubble where, it's great for the team who's building out the platform, but if, it suits their needs, but nobody else's, why am I building it to begin with? So there are lots
Mm-hmm.
of these different little things that I kind of need to think about to go
Mm-hmm.
into that. I think simplicity and looking at what is the
Mm-hmm.
simplest way from point A to point B, and then
Mm-hmm.
can I do that in a repeatable fashion? And so if I can solve those two things first, it makes it easier then to go on to the next step, which is okay, let's consolidate that into a repeatable pattern. And then let's make sure that we're rolling that out into the organization. And that's kind of just a rinse and repeat cycle there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's some really deep stuff. It's kind of like you can even take life notes here, about just just ask the right questions in life also. A lot
I've
of
learned a lot from parenting, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, a lot when you get down to principles, right? They kind of apply across the board to
Very much.
life and to tech.
No, exactly. If one of my girls is like, no, I'm not doing it. The worst thing I can do is push back on it and say, yes, you are doing it, because that every time will fall to pieces. But if I go to them and I say, okay, why aren't you doing it? Like, where's this friction coming from? The story starts to come out. And typically, there's a relatively logical reason for the behavior that they have. And I find that that's also holds true within organizations.
Mm,
If I have a stakeholder in front of me who's really reluctant to do something and that's really pushing against, how I want to drive something, I think that it's really important to then just stop, take a step back and say, where's this
mhm,
friction coming from? Like
mhm,
what doesn't feel right in this scenario? And that, it's really amazing what some of those things will unlock, and sometimes you do completely change course as a result of that
mhm,
because it is really important feedback. But I think it also highlights why it's so important to have a diverse team in front of you, because
mhm,
everyone's going to think a little bit differently, and people from different backgrounds and different education have a different idea than people from more traditional backgrounds. And I think all of them are valid. And I think all of
Hmm.
them have their place. And in bringing those things together, you kind of get the best of all worlds. And that really does help, provided that there's, that trust within the team. But it really does help in terms of velocity and problem solving.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, quite interesting there. Just, I think, yeah, not shying away from those hard discussions, it leads you to the interesting parts of and the surprises that actually need to be known.
Hmm.
And you have that perspective of being on both sides, I think, just building a stack and trying to scale it, and also being a consultant, working with people and their stacks.
Hmm.
Yeah. And what have you observed? Where do you feel more naturally you belong? Like, do you belong more on the side of like building your own stack within the organization, or do you feel like, no, I'd rather just be on the outside and kind of have an impact from the outside, ask those right questions, reveal things that they wouldn't otherwise see. What do you think is your thing?
I don't know. That's a great question. I think generally I like being the translator. So I like getting people to speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if that is internally or externally, um, I think it's kind of secondary. I do love kind of being on the inside and working with teams and like building things because there's
Mm-hmm.
something so satisfying about seeing where your team started and
Mm-hmm.
where where they landed in the end and the progress that they made. Because I think as humans, it's very natural for us to forget all of the accomplishments and just go, okay, we've hit a deadline, on to the next. But to be
Mm-hmm.
able to then like, get them through this and the late nights and the oh no, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this and the high stress levels and then to come in once they've delivered and go, do you understand where you've come from in the past year? Do you understand the growth that you've made technically, but also, think about what you've learned personally over the past year and being able to really like celebrate that with people. I love that. I think there's just nothing
Mm-hmm.
better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's quite something. I definitely see that, there's a lot of, it seems like you're quite interested in just working with people and really, yeah, just bringing out the best and being like a coach, in these complex projects. And that's, yeah, that's quite fascinating. Very necessary, I think.
Yeah, thanks.
Um,
I think
and
it's why I stay in the industry. Tech is interesting. I love it. I love how dynamic it is. I love solving problems, but ultimately, I joined an industry because it was something also that gave me a fair amount of independence and freedom.
Mhm,
And I think it's really important to give that back and make sure
mhm.
that other people can have that same opportunity over time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So going back to the story we started with about just this organization. So I was wondering, did AI feature prominently in their plans from the start, or was that something that came up when they like looked around and saw what options they have? Uh, how did they finally use or not use AI? What are some of the takeaways for in terms of like AI workloads and how they made a difference to this transition?
Yeah, so within this particular organization, it's still something they're investigating. I've seen in some other organizations, they've really started implementing things within like contact centers and ways to help people in a more efficient manner. One of the organizations that I was working with, um, and actually I can give them a verbal shout out. So I was working a bit with a company called Light River,
Mm-hmm.
and have an incredible product that goes in and helps on the like layer zero networking side of things, helps the
Hmm.
NOC see exactly what's going on and how is that visualized. And they have just probably one of the most incredible teams that I've seen on the development side. The
Hmm.
way that they can take the requirements of a customer and translate that into a functioning product is really remarkable. And then the way that they can use then and how they're using AI then to elevate what's visible and do
Hmm.
that in a way that's secure and in a way that really adds value, I think is really one of the few organizations that I've worked with that really has this elevated position when it comes to AI. And that was also, something I think larger industry is quite aware of is that, 95% of AI pilots fail. And again, it's no wonder to me that that happens, just understanding how complex it is to put it in, having now worked with it myself, more hands-on, understanding all the implications behind that. But then also when you're battling these environments that are legacy and greenfield and trying to maintain all of this together and still trying to layer on some automation on top of that,
Hmm.
it's not easy. And I think most
Yeah.
organizations don't have an infrastructure yet that's optimized
Hmm.
for AI, and certainly not for running that at scale or in a way
Hmm.
that could really have an elevated business value.
Hmm.
So that's something I look forward to seeing over the coming years because I do think it's coming. I do think AI absolutely has its place. Yeah, it may be a bit of a bubble right now, but that's how things happen and that's how
Yeah.
innovation happens. And
Hmm.
understanding and just using it and seeing what can I do with it, then I think
Hmm.
that really brings something to the market and really will propel over time organizations forward.
Hmm. Yeah, I think infrastructure, the thing you mentioned there, is also really big. And even some of the other guests on the show have spoken about the same thing, just the infrastructure problems being the biggest with how do we run AI
Hmm.
efficiently, the availability of GPUs, and just how do you share them across workloads, across teams and projects.
Hmm.
Anything else you'd like to comment on in terms of infrastructure challenges related to AI?
I think, keep experimenting with it, but if you want to be in a place to run at large scale on an organizational level, just making sure that your foundations are in place is so important
Hmm.
for AI, but also just, to make sure that you have the capacity and also for developers to have the capacity to be able to do that and spend some time learning and really understanding what are the implications of these things.
Hmm. Hmm. All right, all right. And also about the stat that you mentioned, quite staggering, 95% of AI projects fail. Um, how would you suggest people read that stat? Would you say, someone hearing that say, that's normal, and if that's normal, then we should probably accept any failure rate that's lower than that, or think of it as fail forward, fail fast. So failure is kind of the norm when it comes to AI, or is there something else that, how would you recommend reading that stat?
I think in this stat, it's very much about education and knowledge, and that while you might not have anything tangible that came out of a specific pilot, um, what people learn and can take forward with them and the context and the implications of that are incredibly important and will benefit your organization incredibly. Because there are things that AI requires that we've always said is important, but with AI it becomes just unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say, yeah, assume it's gonna fail, and that's
Mm-hmm.
fine, but
Yeah.
keep doing it because that's the only way that over time. you, your organization, your developers are going to be able to actually understand how to do this at a production level.
All right, all right. Great. We're winding down our conversation, and the last question I have for you is just as you think of the year ahead, what are you reading? What are you keeping track of? What's on your mind, and what do you think is on the horizon for just the next few months or the year ahead?
Um, I'm trying to do more non-work related reading.
Okay.
Um, let's see. In terms of the professional side of things, working on my own projects, for me, being in leadership has meant that I've had to take a step back, and certainly all of the education that I've been doing also meant that I had less time for hands-on. So getting a little bit more hands-on, just with my own things, so that I can again understand what are the implications of some of these things. Um, yeah, just I'm doing my best to yeah be a better question asker, a better listener.
Mhm.
And trying to take things actually counterintuitively, potentially, just a little slower and making sure that the focus is there. Because I do notice that the quality of what I'm able to put forward, is just much better when I'm hyper focused.
All right, all right. Wow, great. Just one last question I have, not about work. Just knowing that, you're into sports, just
Yep.
wondering, do you have a challenge in mind for the next few months that you're kind of working towards? I know you also said you've been recovering from an injury,
Yep.
but I don't know, do you have a challenge on your mind already or not yet?
Oh goodness. My daughter set this challenge, and I'm not sure how on board. Well, I'm on board with this challenge, but it's a doozy. She wants to climb El Cap next fall.
Okay.
So El Capitan, rock climbing.
Oh, okay.
She's agreed on the East Betris, so at least that can be done in a day, and I don't have to spend 2 weeks on the wall. But
Okay. Yeah, but gives you a lot of time, I think, to fully recover and prepare.
it does, it does. So it takes you leave at 6 a.m. and then you're back hopefully around 11 p.m. So it takes about 12 hours to do the
Wow.
pitches, and then it's an hour hike in and an hour and a half hike out.
Amazing that you guys are doing it together. That's, yeah, quite
Yeah,
something.
it's super fun, and it's great fun training with her as well.
Yeah.
You know, she definitely keeps my competitive side up.
Wow, very inspiring. I think next time you're on here, I'll ask you about that.
Oh gosh. Okay. Now it has to happen. It's been
Yeah.
said.
Um, all right, with that, we come to the end of this conversation. Thanks to all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation interesting. And if you'd like to follow Sarah and all that she's up to, I recommend go to LinkedIn and just follow her. She puts out a lot of interesting stuff there about tech and her hobbies. So go and follow her. And stay tuned to our conversations. We do conversations like this every week. So do come back for the next one. Thanks, Sarah, for joining us, and
Thanks so
all the
much,
best
Trey.
for your adventures. We'll see you on the next one.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Bye bye.